Now we mentioned the warp button and that by warping the audio, it'll play in sync with our master tempo. What we haven't really touched on are the different warp modes, which we can find down here, and how they affect how our audio plays back. Now, I mentioned that we had the ability to see warp here on push, but we weren't able to turn it on or turn it off for an audio clip. Once warp is on, though, we can change the different warp modes directly from push and get a sense for how that's going to affect the audio that's playing. So we don't really need to hear the metronome anymore. I'm going to go ahead and turn the metronome off. I'm going to launch this same clip that we had playing before, and I'm going to gradually slow down the tempo, and we'll start experimenting with the different warp modes. So just to be clear where we're at right now, our tempo is 140 for our project. The tempo of this clip is 140. So when we play it right now, it's going to play at its original tempo, and it won't sound time stretched or warped at all. Let's start to slow down the master tempo. Now, if I turn my metronome back on, it's still on beat, but it's playing significantly slower, and it sounds a little odd. The way that it's being stretched sounds a bit weird because there's like little things that are being reversed, and it just sounds very obviously stretched. The reason why is because of the warp mode that we're using, which is the Beats warp mode. The Beats warp mode is best for warping very percussive material and preserving the timing of those transients or the attack of your drum sounds. So if we had something where it wasn't a full song but just like a drum beat, using the Beats warp mode would probably be a good way to preserve the timing of it no matter how fast or slow we played that clip. For whole songs though, it introduces some weird aspects if you're going too far from the original tempo. Now keep in mind, I've basically brought the tempo down by 45 BPM. That's a huge stretch. In an actual live performance, it's unlikely that you would play a song that far from its original tempo, but who am I to dictate what you might do during a live set? It's just important to know what these different warping algorithms will do when you stretch audio to the extreme. Now, tones and texture are two warp modes I generally wouldn't recommend using for full songs. Tones is a warp mode that's intended for monophonic material, meaning there's just one sound playing at a time. For instance, like a single bass, maybe a solo guitar. If you're humming with your voice and you're only doing one note at a time, because obviously humans can't do chords on their own, unless you're into some like interesting Gregorian throat singing or whatever. But the point is that tones is for monophonic material. Texture is for polyphonic material, things where there's multiple notes being generated at once. They might be piano chords, it might be a choir section, but texture just doesn't really sound that good for full songs. The other warp modes, the ones that I think are most relevant for this, are repitch and complex. Let me bring the tempo back to 140 BPM. And we're going to use repitch. And repitch doesn't actually time stretch the audio. If we use repitch, the audio gets treated like vinyl, where if we speed the tempo up, the pitch of the audio will get higher. If we slow the tempo down, the pitch will go lower. But this is going to give you the best overall sonic quality because nothing's being time stretched. So let's hear how this sounds. Start slowing the tempo down. So you can hear the pitch is changing. Now, typically I use repitch because I'm not really concerned about mixing in songs and preserving the same key. So changing the pitch doesn't matter that much. I'm also rarely playing songs that far from their original tempo. So my main concern is preserving the sonic quality. With repitch, you're going to preserve the sonic quality pretty much better than any other warp mode because, again, you're not time stretching. There's no sort of weird tricks that are being made to make the audio play in sync with your master tempo. But if preserving the pitch is your main concern, if you do want to blend songs and mix them in key, repitch is probably not the best option. In that case, I would suggest choosing complex. Now, we've seen the warp modes here on Ableton Live, but I'm going to change the warp mode here on push. Underneath where it says warp, I have my knob here. We're currently on repitch. Let's change this to complex. There we go. So I'm going to go back to the original tempo, and then we'll gradually slow it down, and we'll hear how complex affects the audio. With complex, you can really change the tempo in some extreme drastic ways, and the results typically sound pretty good. The main concern with complex is that it can introduce some phasing on the sub bass of your songs if you're playing them away from the original tempo. And I would caution you, if you're going to use complex for your songs, listen to them on a system that can reproduce some of that deep sub bass and make sure that it's not being hindered or negatively impacted. If you have phasing issues on the sub bass, it can end up making the bass sound a bit too hollow, and that's the last thing that you want in a big club. So because of that, choosing the right warp mode is extremely important, and the 3 warp modes that I would suggest will probably give you the best rate of success. If you're typically staying around the original tempo or only going above it, not going below it, Beats warp mode could work pretty well. If you want the best overall sonic quality and don't really care about mixing songs in key, repitch is the best option. That treats your audio like vinyl. If you want to make sure that you preserve the pitch, the key of the songs, but still want to have some leeway in terms of changing the tempo, complex will probably be your best option. Just make sure that it's not going to negatively impact the sub bass of your songs.